The most powerful invasion fleet in our galaxy was defeated by a human carrying nothing more than a clipboard, and by the time we realized she wasn't harmless, our own flagship had already begun destroying itself from the inside. My name is Threxul Vorn, General of the Cathari Dominion, Conqueror of the Vesserine Cluster, Breaker of the Nerelian Wall, and, as I am about to explain to you in embarrassing detail, the single most humiliated commanding officer in the recorded history of my species. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 43 victories, 1 loss. And the loss came from a planet my own scouts described in their official report, and I am reading this from memory because I have read it approximately 400 times since, as, and I quote, "low priority, minimal technological threat, recommend standard subjugation protocol." Standard subjugation protocol. Written down, in ink, well, in the digital equivalent of ink, because we are a spacefaring civilization and not savages who still use ink. But you understand my point. Let me back up. Let me tell you how a general with an unbroken record, a general whose bust sits in 3 separate war academies, a general who once forced an entire planetary senate to sign their own surrender using a pen made from the femur of their previous ruler, because that is the kind of theater that wins hearts and minds. Let me tell you how that general ended up outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly educated by a human woman who looked like she weighed less than my sidearm. Her name was Ellie Duncan. Remember that name? I certainly do. I will remember it until the day I die, which, given recent events, might be sooner than I had planned. It started, as these things always start, with overconfidence, which in my defense is not a character flaw when you have never once been wrong. Overconfidence is simply confidence that has not yet been tested. Mine had never been tested, not once. Not in 300 years of service, not across 43 campaigns, not against the Vesserine who fought with weaponized gravity wells, not against the Nirelians who could theoretically turn a battleship inside out with their minds if given enough preparation time, which we made sure they never had. 43 worlds. And every single one of them fell exactly according to plan. So when the scouting reports came back on the little blue planet at the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm, a planet its own inhabitants called Earth, with the sort of self-importance only a species that has never left its own solar system can muster, I did not feel concern. I felt something closer to boredom. Their technology, according to the reports, consisted of primitive fission reactors, chemical propulsion rockets that still, and I am not making this up, occasionally exploded on the launch pad, and a communications network so fragile that a moderately strong solar flare could apparently disable it for days. Their military forces were organized into something called nations, which as far as I could tell meant they had not even achieved basic unification as a species and were still, charmingly, fighting each other over borders drawn by dead men centuries ago. I stood on the observation deck of my flagship, the Devourer of Silent Worlds, which I will admit is a name that promises rather more than delivers, given recent events, and I looked down at that planet, blue and green and utterly adorably unprepared, and I said to my first officer, a Cathari named Braxis who had served with me for 11 campaigns, "This one will not even require a full fleet." Braxis, to his credit, and I want this on record because he deserves better than what eventually happened to his career, Braxis said, "General, our protocols do recommend full force deployment on any world with independent industrial capacity." And I laughed. I actually laughed, out loud, on the bridge, in front of the junior officers, which I do not typically do because it undermines discipline, but I could not help myself. I said, "Braxis, their industrial capacity consists of burning ancient dead plants to boil water into steam. I have seen toddlers on Vesserine 3 construct more sophisticated technology out of boredom. I brought the full fleet anyway. Not because I thought I needed it, because a general who has conquered 43 worlds does not become the general who conquered 43 worlds by taking unnecessary risks with the one that becomes his 44th. I brought 12 capital ships, 600 fighter craft, and enough ground forces to occupy a landmass the size of what the humans apparently call a continent, though which continent, I genuinely could not tell you, since after the first few hours down there, Geography became rather less important to me than survival. We descended on a research facility. Our sensors had identified it as a low-security scientific outpost, the kind of place where humans apparently studied things like weather patterns and rocks, which, again, tells you everything you need to know about how seriously I was taking this operation. I expected panic. I expected sirens. I expected, frankly, the sort of screaming and running that I had come to find almost soothing after 3 centuries of conquest. The universal language of a species realizing it has just met something bigger than itself. What I got instead was a woman standing in the parking lot with a clipboard. A clipboard. She had brown hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had done it in a hurry, and she was wearing what I would later learn was called a lab coat, which appeared to be standard uniform for human scientists. And she looked up at my landing craft as it descended, engines roaring, kicking up enough dust and debris to flatten most of the surrounding vegetation, and she did not run. She did not scream. She squinted, the way you might squint at a delivery truck that had parked somewhat inconveniently, and then she checked something on her clipboard. I disembarked personally. This was, in retrospect, my second mistake, the first being underestimating the entire species, but I did not know that yet. So allow me my confidence a little longer, since it is about to be taken from me rather thoroughly. I stood before her in full ceremonial armor, the kind we reserve for first contact scenarios, specifically because it is designed to inspire terror. All jagged plating and glowing sigils and a height advantage of roughly 2 feet. And I said, through the translation device strapped to my chest, "Kneel before the Cathari Dominion. Your world now belongs to us." She looked at me. She looked at the translation device. Then she looked back at me and said, and I remember this exactly because I have replayed the recording so many times my crew have started avoiding eye contact with me during meetings, she said, "Do you have that in writing? Because my supervisor is going to need something in writing before I can authorize a planetary surrender. There's a form. There's a form." I did not have a response prepared for this. In 300 years, across 43 worlds, no one had ever asked me for paperwork. I had rulers who wept. I had generals who fell on their own weapons rather than surrender the shame. I had one particularly memorable Vesserine warlord who tried to bite through his own throat rather than face capture, which, I want to be clear, we prevented, because a dead warlord makes for a poor surrender ceremony. Not once, in all of that, had anyone asked me for a form. "There is no form," I said. "I am the form. My presence is the form." She wrote something down on her clipboard. I genuinely do not know to this day what she wrote. I have thought about requesting that clipboard as a war trophy, honestly, just to know. "Right," she said. "Well, I'm going to need to call someone about this, because I don't actually have the authority to surrender a planet. I'm an engineer. I fix the water filtration system here. You might want to talk to someone in, like, actual government." Her name, I would learn shortly after, was Ellie Duncan, and I want you to understand, at this point in the story, I still thought I was the one in control of the situation. I actually thought bringing her aboard my flagship for questioning was a clever tactical move, extracting information from a low-level human before making contact with their actual leadership. I thought I was being efficient. I was being fed exactly the situation she wanted. I did not know that yet, of course. Hindsight, as the humans say, apparently has excellent vision, which is a phrase I did not understand at the time and now find unbearably appropriate. We brought her aboard. She did not resist, which I found strange, and now understand to be because resisting was never her plan. She walked up the boarding ramp of my shuttle with the mild irritation of someone who has been asked to stay late for an unnecessary meeting, and she looked around at the interior of Cathari military technology, the humming energy conduits, the glowing control panels, the armored guards standing at attention, and she said, "Huh, this is nicer than I expected. Kind of tacky, but nicer." Tacky. My flagship. Tacky. I had her brought to the interrogation chamber, which is a room specifically designed, through lighting, temperature, and subtle pressure variations in the air, to induce a state of psychological discomfort in most sentient species. It has worked on beings far more physically imposing than a human. It has made Vesserine warlords, creatures 11 feet tall with skin like armor plating, break into cold sweats within minutes. Ellie Duncan sat down in the chair across from me, looked around the room and said, "Is it always this cold in here? Because if you're going for intimidation, you might want to know that humans just associate cold rooms with hospitals. This feels more like I'm about to get a physical than get tortured." I sat across from her, my hands folded on the table between us, and I said, "You understand your species has just lost. Your planet is now a possession of the Cathari Dominion." "Sure," she said. "Okay, so quick question, and I promise this is relevant. What's your power source? Like for the ship? Fusion? Antimatter? Something we haven't figured out yet?" I stared at her. This was not how interrogations were supposed to go. I was supposed to ask the questions. She was supposed to answer them carefully, providing me with troop locations and defense capabilities and the location of her planet's leadership. "I ask the questions," I told her. "Right, sorry," she said. "It's a professional habit. I like to know how things work. So, are you going to ask me something, or are we just going to sit here?" I asked her where her planet's military command was located. She told me she genuinely did not know, which I believed, because she was an engineer at a research facility and not, as far as my sensors could determine, lying. Though human physiology made lie detection more difficult than usual, their heart rates apparently fluctuating for reasons entirely unrelated to deception, which I found deeply inconvenient. I asked her about troop strength. She shrugged and said something about how she didn't really follow the news. She was more of a science person. At some point, and I genuinely do not know how this happened, the interrogation turned into her asking me questions about ship maintenance schedules and me apparently answering them because it felt easier than continuing to get nowhere with my own questions, and because, frankly, no one had ever expressed this much genuine interest in my engineering department before. Most prisoners cry. She asked about coolant cycling. I want to be very clear that I recognize now how insane this sounds. I recognize that a Cathari general, 300 years of service, 43 conquered worlds, sat in an interrogation chamber and explained thermal regulation systems to a captured enemy combatant because she asked nicely and seemed impressed by the technology. I recognize this. I have made my peace with it, or at least, I am working on making my peace with it. My therapist tells me this will take time, and yes, we have therapists. Conquering 43 worlds is stressful work. After the interrogation, I made my third mistake. Though at the time I believed it to be a masterstroke of psychological warfare, I decided to show her around the ship. My reasoning, and I want you to understand this made sense to me at the time, was that showing a human our technology up close would demoralize her completely. She would see the scale of what we had built, the elegance of our engineering, the sheer impossibility of resistance, and she would break, and through her, her species would break, because surely word would spread of what she had seen. Braxis objected. "I want that on the record too," Braxis said. "General, granting a captured combatant access to engineering sections violates 17 separate security protocols." I told him that 17 protocols were written for enemies capable of doing something with the information. I told him she was an engineer who fixed water filters. I told him, and this is the line I regret most in this entire story, I told him, "What is she going to do, Braxis? Reroute our shield generators with a screwdriver?" I would like to now formally apologize to Braxis, wherever he is currently stationed, which I believe is a supply depot near the Outer Rim, because that is exactly what she did. We walked through the ship together, myself and 2 guards and Ellie Duncan, and she asked questions the entire way. Reasonable questions. Curious questions, the kind of questions that, at the time, seemed like the harmless fascination of someone encountering technology far beyond her understanding. She asked about our shield harmonics. She asked about our cooling systems, again, apparently very concerned about our cooling systems, which in retrospect should have told me something. She asked about the layout of our primary power relay, which I showed her, because why would I not? She was clearly just an engineer marveling at superior engineering, and marveling is what conquered peoples are supposed to do. At one point she stopped in front of an access panel near the engine core, ran her hand along the seam where 2 plates met, and said, "You guys really don't expect anyone to ever touch this stuff, do you?" "No one has ever needed to touch it," I said. No one has ever gotten close enough." She smiled at that. I did not understand the smile at the time. I understand it now. It was the smile of someone who has just confirmed something they already suspected. I gave her more access than I should have. I let her stand near systems I would have executed my own officers for approaching without authorization. I did this because I believed, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never once been wrong, that there was nothing she could do with that access. She had no weapon. She had no tools beyond a small bag she had been allowed to keep, which my security team had scanned and found to contain nothing more threatening than what she called basic engineering supplies. A multi-tool, some wire, small devices my scanners registered as low-power diagnostic equipment consistent with her stated profession. I found out later that human diagnostic equipment can be repurposed in ways our scanners were simply not designed to detect, because we had never encountered a species clever enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to try. We build our scanners to detect weapons. We do not build them to detect a screwdriver in the hands of someone who has spent her entire life fixing things that were never designed to be fixed by the people using them. This is, I believe, the actual difference between our species. We conquer worlds with superior technology built by generations of unchallenged dominance. Humans fix things with whatever is in the drawer because their entire history is one of scarcity and improvisation and never ever having quite enough. I did not understand this yet. I was about to. Within a day of returning her to a holding cell, small problems began appearing across the fleet. I want to stress that they were individually insignificant. A cooling relay on the Devourer of Silent Worlds ran 4 degrees warmer than specification. A door on Deck 7 sealed unexpectedly during a routine patrol, trapping 2 crew members for 11 minutes before engineers forced it open. A translation device in the communications bay began rendering every incoming transmission in what my linguistics officer described as aggressively sarcastic, which, again, in retrospect, should have told me something, but at the time I simply assumed it was a translation error. Because translation errors happen, technology is imperfect, and I had far more important things to worry about, such as planning the full occupation of a planet whose leadership had still not formally responded to my surrender demand, which, again, in retrospect, I blamed turbulence. I blamed rival factions within the Dominion, because political sabotage is not unheard of among ambitious officers hoping to see a general fail. I blamed, at one particularly frustrated moment, the humidity of the human atmosphere affecting our external sensors, which does not even make sense. Our ships are hermetically sealed, but I was grasping at that point, and I did not yet know I was grasping at the wrong thing entirely. Meanwhile, down on the surface, something else was happening. Something I did not learn about until much later, when the pieces finally came together in a way that made me want to throw my ceremonial armor into the nearest sun. The humans were not preparing to fight us. Not directly. Their military forces, such as they were, remained largely stationary, which I had taken as further evidence of their primitive disorganization. What I did not understand was that they were buying time. Every hour that Ellie Duncan spent asking me polite questions about coolant cycling was an hour their scientists spent analyzing the debris field from our initial atmospheric entry, an hour their engineers spent studying every scrap of Cathari technology that had fallen off our ships during landing, which apparently happens more than I would like to admit. We do occasionally shed panels during atmospheric entry, and an hour their communications team spent quietly coordinating a response that had nothing to do with tanks or fighter jets, and everything to do with a woman with a clipboard and a multi-tool who had walked willingly onto my flagship because she had, apparently, volunteered for exactly this role the moment our fleet was detected. "I want you to sit with that," she volunteered. This entire time, I believed I had captured her. I had, in fact, been handed to her, gift-wrapped, by her own planet's leadership, because someone down there had looked at incoming reports of an alien invasion fleet and said, essentially, "Send the engineer, she will figure out how it works." The confrontation, when it came, happened on what I believe humans would call the 3rd day of the occupation, though our fleet uses a different chronological system, so forgive me if the timeline feels slightly imprecise. I had returned to the holding cell to question her again, growing increasingly frustrated by the fleet's mounting technical issues and increasingly suspicious, finally embarrassingly late, that something was deeply wrong. She was sitting on the small bunk in her cell, and when I entered, she looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as patient amusement, the way you might look at a child who has just figured out, on their own several hours after everyone else, that the stove is hot. "You figured it out," she said. It was not a question. "Figured out what?" I said, though I already suspected the answer, and I hated how much I suspected it. "That your fleet has been slowly falling apart for 2 days," she said, "and that it's not turbulence. And it's not sabotage from your rival factions, though, side note, you guys really do have some interesting internal politics. I picked up a lot listening to your officers talk near me like I couldn't understand tone. And it's definitely not humidity, because I heard someone actually suggest that, which honestly kind of insulting that you thought that was more likely than the truth." "Explain," I said, and my voice, I will admit, had lost some of its earlier grandeur. "You gave me a full tour of your ship," she said. "You let me touch your access panels. You let me stand next to your primary power relay for almost 10 minutes while you explained how proud you were that no one had ever gotten close enough to touch it. You gave a professional engineer, whose entire job is understanding systems she's never seen before and fixing them with whatever's in her bag, unsupervised access to the most critical infrastructure on your ship, because you assumed that since I couldn't build a warship, I couldn't possibly do anything dangerous to one. I did not respond because there was nothing to say that would not make my situation worse. Small tools," she continued, "small changes. Nothing you'd catch on a routine scan because I wasn't planting bombs, I was planting problems. A slightly miscalibrated sensor here, a software patch that looks like standard diagnostic residue there. Little things that on their own mean nothing, but that compound. Your cooling system thinks it's running 4 degrees warmer than it is, so it's been quietly overcorrecting for 2 days, which means your reactor's been running slightly outside optimal parameters this whole time without anyone noticing, because who checks a system that's supposedly working fine? Your door controls on Deck 7 have a timing fault that's going to get worse every cycle. Your translation array is going to keep getting weirder until someone actually opens it up and finds what I left inside, and by the way, good luck with that because I made it look like corrosion." "Why?" I said. And I want you to know that this was the first time in 300 years that word had left my mouth in genuine, unguarded confusion, rather than as a rhetorical device before an execution. "Why would your leadership send an engineer instead of soldiers?" She smiled. And it was not a cruel smile, which somehow made it worse. It was almost sympathetic. "Because you already knew what soldiers look like," she said. "You've beaten 43 worlds full of them. You know how to spot an army. You know how to spot a weapon. You have scanners built specifically to catch every threat you've ever encountered before. What you don't have is a scanner built to catch someone who isn't a threat at all, until she is. We didn't send you our strongest fighter. We sent you the person you'd be least likely to take seriously. That was never a flaw in the plan, General. That was the entire plan." I stood there in that small holding cell, 300 years of unbroken victory sitting somewhere behind my sternum like a stone, and I understood, finally and completely, exactly how thoroughly I had been played. "The lesson," I said slowly, "is that you never let the enemy underestimate you." "No," she said, standing up from the bunk, brushing off her clothes as though she were preparing to leave a mildly disappointing meeting rather than an alien holding cell. "The lesson is the opposite. Let them underestimate you completely. Encourage it. Hand them the clipboard yourself if you have to. Because the moment someone decides you're not a threat, they stop watching you closely enough to notice you becoming one." The cascading failures began in earnest 4 hours later. I have read the full engineering report since, compiled by my own staff in the humiliating aftermath, and I will spare you most of the technical detail, partly because it is deeply embarrassing, and partly because I suspect you would rather hear about the chaos than the specifications. The reactor, running slightly outside its parameters for 2 days due to the false cooling data, finally tripped a cascading safety shutdown across the devourer of silent worlds, which in turn knocked out primary power to 6 of my 12 capital ships, all of which were drawing supplemental power through a networked grid I had insisted upon years earlier because it improved fleet efficiency by 11%, and which now improved absolutely nothing except the speed at which one ship's problem became everyone's problem. Doors sealed shut across 3 vessels simultaneously, trapping crew in corridors, in mess halls, in one particularly unfortunate case, in a supply closet with, according to the report, insufficient ventilation for the number of personnel present, which is a very polite way of saying several of my officers spent 40 minutes extremely uncomfortable and extremely angry. The translation array, when finally opened for emergency inspection, was found to contain a piece of chewing gum, which I am told is a human confectionery product, wedged precisely into a critical relay junction in a way that caused intermittent short circuits every time the ship's internal temperature fluctuated by more than 2 degrees, which, given our cooling problems, was constantly chewing gum. 43 worlds conquered, and my communications array was defeated by chewing gum. Shield generators, drawing on the same compromised power grid, flickered and failed across the fleet at the precise moment that, and I want to stress this timing was not a coincidence, Earth's actual military forces, the ones I had dismissed as adorable and disorganized, launched a coordinated response using technology reverse-engineered in less than 72 hours from the debris of our own ships. I do not know how they managed this so quickly. I have my suspicions, and my suspicions all involve Ellie Duncan sending detailed technical notes to someone through means I still have not identified, and honestly, at this point, I have stopped trying to identify them because I suspect the answer will only upset me further. My bridge, once a place of calm, absolute authority, where my word moved starships and ended wars, became a scene of controlled panic that grew steadily less controlled by the minute. Braxus, to his eternal credit, kept his composure throughout, shouting damage reports over the blaring emergency klaxons, coordinating what repairs could be made with power systems that kept failing faster than they could be fixed. "General," he said to me at one point over the noise, "we need to consider that this situation may not be recoverable through combat. I want you to understand what it costs a Cathari general to hear those words. 300 years, 43 worlds, and now my own first officer, a man who had never once suggested retreat in 11 campaigns together, was telling me that combat was no longer the answer." "What is the answer then?" I said, and I do not think I have ever sounded less like a conqueror in my entire life. "Negotiation," he said, "from a position we no longer control." I stood on that bridge, lights flickering, alarms wailing, my once magnificent flagship reduced to a wounded animal drifting in low orbit above a planet I had, 3 days earlier, described as requiring less than a full fleet, and I laughed. I actually laughed, the same way I had laughed at Braxus's warning before all of this began, except this time the laugh had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from watching your entire worldview collapse in real time. We opened communications with the surface. It took embarrassingly little time for them to respond, which told me they had been waiting, ready, the entire time, watching my fleet fall apart from the inside exactly as planned. Ellie Duncan appeared on the screen, no longer in a holding cell, standing instead in what appeared to be a modest control room somewhere on the surface, still wearing the same lab coat, looking, infuriatingly, exactly as calm as she had looked standing in that parking lot 3 days earlier with her clipboard. "General Vorn," she said, "I hear you're having some technical difficulties." I did not have the energy to be sarcastic back. "This, I think, tells you everything about how far I had fallen." "You have crippled my fleet," I said, using nothing more than a bag of tools and a piece of chewing candy. "Gum," she corrected, "and a screwdriver, and a soldering kit, and about 40 hours of very careful, very boring work, while you personally walked me around explaining how confident you were that no one could ever touch your systems." "What do you want?" I asked, because there is a point in every defeat where pride simply becomes an obstacle to survival, and I had, by that point in the conversation, finally reached it. "We want you to leave," she said, peacefully. We want you to take whatever ships you have left that can still fly and go home and tell your Dominion or whoever you answer to that Earth is not worth the trouble, not because we're weak, because we're exactly the kind of trouble that costs more than it's worth to conquer. We wanted you to learn that lesson personally, so you could carry it back with you, instead of us having to teach it to every fleet you might send afterward. I sat with that for a long moment, watching my crew around me trying, and largely failing, to bring critical systems back online, watching Braxis coordinate a damage control effort that felt increasingly like rearranging furniture on a sinking vessel. And if I refuse, I said, though we both knew it was not really a question, then I imagine your reactor finishes failing sometime in the next 6 hours, she said, and we have a very different conversation about what happens to the survivors. But I don't think you want that conversation. I think you're smarter than that. I think that's actually the whole problem here, General. You are smart. You're just used to being the smartest thing in every room you've ever walked into, and nobody ever taught you what to do the one time that stops being true. I gave the order to withdraw 3 hours later, after engineers managed to stabilize enough systems to make a slow, humiliating retreat possible. It took 2 full days for the fleet to limp far enough from Earth's gravity well to engage our long-range drive systems, 2 days during which every single member of my crew had ample opportunity to watch their general sit in silence, staring at nothing, recalculating 3 centuries of certainty into something considerably smaller. Before we left, Ellie Duncan sent one final transmission, addressed personally to me, which Braxis, with what I can only describe as remarkable restraint, played for me privately rather than over the ship's general channel, sparing me at least that particular indignity. "Hey, General," she said, and even now, replaying it, I cannot decide if her tone was mocking or something closer to kind, possibly both. Humans seem capable of holding both at once in a way I am still trying to understand. For what it's worth, you're not a bad commander. You just fought 43 wars against people who thought like soldiers. We don't. Half of winning is knowing what kind of fight you're actually in, and you never even considered you might be in a different one. Something to think about on the way home. Also, you left some scanning equipment on the surface. We're keeping it. Consider it tuition. Tuition. I returned to Dominion territory considerably diminished, in ship count, in crew morale, and, I will admit, in my own sense of self. I filed my official report honestly, because the alternative was a court-martial for falsifying combat records, and while I have many flaws, apparently including staggering overconfidence and an inability to correctly assess a woman with a clipboard, dishonesty has never been one of them. The report, should you ever have clearance to read it, states plainly that the Cathari Dominion's 44th campaign ended not in defeat by superior force, but in defeat by superior thinking, delivered by a single engineer who understood something it took me 300 years and 43 victories to finally learn. Underestimation is not a weapon you use against your enemy. It is a weapon your enemy uses against you, the moment you let them see you holding it. I think about her sometimes, Ellie Duncan, standing in that parking lot with her clipboard, utterly unbothered by a warship the size of a small city descending onto her research facility, already, even then, 3 moves ahead of a general who genuinely believed the fight was already over. I think about the fact that her planet's leadership looked at an invading fleet and chose to send, of all people, an engineer who fixed water filters, because they understood something about war that my entire civilization, for all its conquest, had never bothered to learn. That the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one who looks like a threat. It is the one you decide not to watch closely enough. I do not know if the Dominion will send another fleet to Earth. I have advised, in the strongest possible terms, that they should not, and if they insist on doing so anyway, I have advised with equal strength that whoever leads that fleet should be handed a copy of my report and required to read it twice before departure, and should, under no circumstances whatsoever, allow a single human anywhere near an access panel, regardless of how harmless, how curious, or how politely they ask about the coolant system. Because I promise you, if they ask about the coolant system, they already know exactly what they are doing.